Okay, hi. We're starting on this third recording on the introduction to consequentialism for module 3. So in the last recording, we ended with the idea that utilitarianism, the core of the theory, the greatest happiness principle, is a right maker in the right maker only, and that a decision procedure, the practical part of the theory, is still missing. So we have to address something. We have to address this idea that there's something missing. The theory is not yet complete. So let's talk about utilitarianism and common sense morality. If you read the Mill text closely, you will notice that Mill is happy enough to take over certain areas of common sense morality, the part that tells you not to lie, the part that tells you to care about others, etc. It has a good impact on promoting the greatest happiness of the greatest number. So he's happy enough to encourage people who have learned that from their socialization, from their families, from their schools, not necessarily with utilitarian intention. So the first part is that the practical element in utilitarianism can start off or can take off from common sense morality. Utilitarians are committed to some rules of common sense morality. And I underline the word some because they really do think that some parts of common sense morality, some parts of folk morality, some of the things that we learn from our culture, from our society, should be modified and recalibrated so that it's more aligned or directly aligned with promoting the greatest happiness of the greatest number. The other thing about common sense morality or folk morality is that utilitarians recognize that there is a cost to changing the way people think. The way that we think about right and wrong is a byproduct of both socialization and our nature, our biological, our psychological nature. So we are social animals and we have evolved to care about other conspecifics. That's just the way we are. So if utilitarians are going to propose a certain change in the way we live out our lives, we recognize that there's a cost to changing things and that changing cannot be into anything. So they're happy enough to say, okay, tell the truth, care for others. Here, I want to talk about an idea that's very important for utilitarians, which is that an action has a long-term and a short-term effect. This is actually connected to common sense morality also. So imagine this case, which is very similar to the trolley problem. It involves a doctor who has 5 sick patients. So this physician has 5 sick patients. All those people, all those 5, need a transplant of some sort. Let's say one of them needs a heart and 2 of them need kidney, so 1 kidney each, and the other 2 need liver transplant. So 5 very, very sick people, if they don't get treated, they're going to die. And then there is 1 healthy patient who comes in on that day for a general checkup. So let's say it's an annual physical exam. He gets a full workup, blood tests, x-rays, everything, right? And then the physician discovers that this 1 healthy patient is a perfect match for his 5 sick patients. So he can be the donor for the heart, for the kidneys, for the liver. Usually, there can be a living donor for a liver, so that if you get part of a person's liver, that's usually enough for 1 person who needs a transplant. But in this case, there's 2, right? So this would make sense for the doctor, for the physician, to kill 1 healthy individual to save 5 sick people. It seems that the aggregate, the total well-being will be increased by saving the 5. But let's notice that's only in terms of short-term or even apparent short-term consequence. So, and this is different from the act utilitarian infringement because there's a difference between discovering in a society, in a community, or in a country that there are a few freeloaders. Those freeloaders are probably going to be detested and excluded. It's one thing to discover that, and it's completely another thing to discover that in your community, in your country, it can happen that a healthy individual comes in for a medical check and ends up being killed by the physician for the sake of sick patients in the hospital. Discovery of this kind will make trust in healthcare professionals collapse, and it will yield very bad long-term consequences, right? And we actually don't have to do the thought experiment for this. This is common sense. So utilitarians are perfectly happy to say, okay, there's a rule. It's inscribed in the Hippocratic Oath. It is part of common sense morality that first, do no harm. A physician is allowed to do interventions, engage in interventions that will make a patient better, but the first rule is do no harm. And of course, killing a healthy individual to save 5 sick people is harming that individual. So that violates an important rule, and violation of the important rule has bad long-term consequences. In other words, it sets a bad precedent. So far, so good. It looks like the utilitarian can have a decision procedure based on these rules that that we already have, right? But usually, utilitarians want to go further. And this is where rule utilitarianism comes in. This is another more complex and I think more insightful version of the theory. In some parts of Mill's text, he talks like a rule utilitarian actually, but this version, this very clearly delineated version of the theory only became widely recognized after the 19th century. So Mill was not using this terminology. What is rule utilitarianism? Rule utilitarianism is an indirect form of utilitarianism. Basically, this is learning from examples such as the act utilitarian Frenchman and saying, you know, there's a problem if we try to directly apply this theory. It's attractive, but for it to be useful, we have to have something else apart from applying it directly to cases. So here's the definition of right action according to rule utilitarians. An act is permissible if and only if it conforms to rules that, if generally followed, meaning internalized, upheld, and considered as moral rules with emotional force, considered as moral rules, which has a special status, would produce the greatest happiness of the greatest number. So again, it's in keeping with the spirit of the original utilitarian theory of J.S. Mill. The goal is to produce maximum net welfare, but for the practical side, what we must do is figure out what should be included in our utilitarian moral code, or the moral code that's going to be endorsed by utilitarians. Now, like I said, when we are trying to formulate a utilitarian moral code, we are not exactly beginning from scratch. We are beginning from the things that we already get from folk morality or from common sense, right? So rule utilitarianism avoids some criticism directed at act utilitarianism. So we won't get the act utilitarian Frenchman objection here. It also avoids the objection from expediency by recognizing that violating certain moral rules have bad long-term consequences because they dilute our ability to trust others and dilute our ability to follow the rule in the long term. This is actually a psychological insight about human beings. If you know that people always tell the truth, that they follow the rule on truth telling, you tend to trust them, right? But if someone you know, whom you consider trustworthy, whom you consider honest, tells you the truth, right? If that person lies once, let's say it's a good friend or a family member, if that person lies once about something important, then the trust is thereby destroyed. It doesn't matter that they told the truth 100, 1,000 times before that. One big lie, when we discover the big lie, then there is corrosion in our trust and possibly a collapse in the relationship. So there is an insight here about the importance of consistency, that we get the long-term, we get the good effect from telling the truth only when we're consistent about it to each other, right? So again, this is outcome oriented, but it is sensitive enough to recognize what human beings are like, right? If actually we become someone like the act utilitarian Frenchman, we become a person who's always trying to get ahead, who's always trying to get his own personal advantage, and does not seem to care deeply about other people, which is one of the problems that we encountered previously. So there are still criticisms to rule utilitarianism, so I have them at the bottom of the slide. I am not going to discuss those objections just now. We will go back to them later. But for now, I will explain how rule utilitarians choose which rule to modify and how they modify those rules. We already saw an example of rules that rule utilitarians will adopt, will be perfectly happy to take over from common sense morality, but there are rules that they will modify to build this so-called utilitarian moral code. To speak about the rule that they will change, I will talk about ideas from this philosopher. His name is Peter Singer. He's well-known, even notorious utilitarian, and there are problematic aspects of his utilitarianism. But for this recording, at least, I will talk about one of the most reasonable sides or reasonable aspects of his view. So he is well known for, well, one of the things that he's well known for is animal rights. His book on animal rights is considered groundbreaking, and he takes promoting the greatest happiness of the greatest number to be promoting the greatest happiness of the greatest number of sentient beings. So that means living beings, including non-humans, that can feel pain and can feel pleasure, can be happy. Okay, now I'm going to talk about this idea from Singer about changing the way we look at charity. So there's this famous book that he has. It came out later, but the groundbreaking idea came much earlier in a short, well-known article called Famine, Affluence, and Morality. So what's the proposal? The proposal is to change the way we think about charity. How do we think about charity? Quick answer is, we think charitable giving is optional. So making a donation to an organization or a group is considered good but optional. So it's a matter of supererogation. So if you try to save up money, no matter how small the amount, so that you can contribute it to the community pantry close to you or whatever organization that helps the needy, that's a good thing to do, but you don't have to do it, right? That's the idea. Now, this is the thing that utilitarians want us to change. They want us to change the way we think of charity, because we think giving money, an act of charity, donating to a community pantry, money or goods, if you fail to do it, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. It's your money. It's your set of resources. It's for you to use. So if you have, say, canned goods or other food that you're not eating, but you allow them to expire and nobody eats them and they get wasted, and there's a community pantry next door and you don't donate them, maybe we're approaching the territory here of asking questions about decisions like that, right? So when you have something over and on top of what you need for your own needs and working towards your self-realization on an ongoing basis, that extra, right? If you give that to charity, that's good. If you don't give that to charity, there's nothing wrong with that. That's the position that Peter Singer wants us to change. And he uses an argument, a neat and interesting argument to get us to see that we should change this ordinary, this folk morality view on charity. So this is the premise that he now wants us to accept. He says, if it's in our power to prevent something very bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything morally significant, then we ought to do it. So how does he get us to accept this principle and say it's true, we must apply it to ourselves? He gives an example of a child drowning in a shallow pond. So imagine a 1-year-old child, let's say there's a 1-year-old child that fell into a shallow pond. So there's a hole in the ground, it's been raining and there's water. There, maybe the water is not very deep, maybe it's a foot deep or a foot and a half deep, so it's shallow, but the child falls in. The child falls in right in front of me. There's nobody else there but me and the child. Should I prevent the child from drowning? In this case, it's a very easy thing for me. I just step close to the edge of the pond. I reach in and I scoop the child out. No swimming required. Maybe my shoes and the edges of my pants or my skirt will be dirty, depending on how close or far to the edge of the pond the child is. But that's not a lot, right? Dirty shoes, dirty pants. If my pants are nice, they can be ruined forever. But you know, the thing is, I am saving a child's life. If I fail to do this, the child dies. And that's irrevocable. That's a death of an innocent that can grow up and a person who can be happy, a person who can make contributions to society. So very bad. If I fail to rescue a child in that scenario, there's nobody else there, I will have been a monster in many other people's eyes. Like if I fail to scoop out a drowning child in a shallow pond just because I don't want dirty shoes, that's just a horrible way to think and to behave and to be in the world, right? So Singer banks on this sense, very strong sense that we already had. In fact, whenever I talk about this example and I bring it up to students, I say, you know, most likely, if this actually happened, it will create scandal and news articles will be written about it, right? So Singer says, we do think there is something wrong when we fail to prevent something very bad from happening, right? So they say, Singer specifically says, but we are always in this position, right? He says, there are people suffering from hunger and malnutrition. Malnutrition is very bad for children between the ages of 2 and 6. If a child between the ages of 2 and 6 does not get proper nutrition 95% of the time, they're technically malnourished, and being technically malnourished at that age means very bad consequences for brain development. If certain targets in brain development are not met in those ages, then it's possible that their brain will never fully develop and they can become the kind of adults who have difficulty in learning even skills that are fairly basic. So they will have problems in school. Those problems in school will persist and accumulate, and there's no going back to that time window between the ages of 2 and 6 where proper brain development through proper nutrition can happen, right? But there are not just thousands, but millions of such children in our country and billions of such children in the world. they are in danger of dying from starvation or very intense lifelong suffering because they are malnourished between the ages of 2 and 6. And there are actually programs and organizations that come in, figure out where the malnourished children are, and engage in feeding programs so that the children have food in their stomachs, they have proper brain development, and also the practical side, if they go to school, their stomach is not grumbling and they're able to pay attention. Of course, now during the pandemic, school is quite different, but you get the idea, right? Even if we're not doing face-to-face classes, you know, the window between ages 2 and 6 is very critical, and brain development should be happening during that time, right? So Singer says, how come we think differently of the shallow pond case and the case of a person who hears about this short piece about children starving and becoming malnourished and thereby dying or suffering, right? And you can contribute to a community pantry near you. You communicate to church organizations that engage in feeding. You can make a contribution to UNICEF, which also engages in feeding of the hungry. But you don't do it. You get a flyer and you get the idea. You crumple the flyer. You have something to give. And it can be as little as 2 pesos a day, right? Most people can give that, or something in the vicinity of 2 pesos to 20 pesos a day. Maybe 20 pesos a day is quite high given current economic conditions, but 2 pesos a day might be doable for virtually all listeners of this recording, right? That can make a difference because, of course, the organizations pull together the resources and they're able to cook in batches and they're able to feed a lot of people, right? So according to Singer, when we say that in the shallow pond example, I do something wrong when I fail to scoop the child out of the water. But in the charity case where I get the flyer about the feeding program, I know that I have money to save or to give at that moment and I do nothing. The crucial difference is in the shallow pond example, the drowning child, the dying child, the suffering child is right in front of me. But in the case of the flyer, or I see something on Facebook, a posting about the feeding program, the suffering child is not in front of me. So Singer says, when I make a decision based on the child drowning in the shallow pond is right in front of me, the child suffering from malnutrition and grave hunger is not in front of me, then I am discriminating on the basis of distance, right? So I don't help the people who are farther away from me, and there seems to be a problem with that, right? So Singer's conclusion is we should change the way we think of charity. We should think about it as something morally required so that we can encourage. The goal is not to guilt trip people and make them feel unhappy, because that's not the thing that will yield good consequences. The goal is to get people to a new default. And the default is that I should be saving or giving on a regular basis, because this is the wealth redistribution that's needed to prevent something morally significant from being lost. In this case, proper development of children and preventing malnourishment and death. Now, Singer's idea is pretty radical. Changing the way that we conceive of charity is very radical. But even if it's radical, I want to draw attention to something interesting, which is that Singer's idea about giving away the thing that we don't need to those who need it more is not entirely new. And this is a point that an atheist and controversial utilitarian like Peter Singer can agree on with someone like Thomas Aquinas. So this is an example, again, this is an example that addresses the relativism objection. Remember the objection that there can be no consensus on morality. Morality is compartmentalized. people from different cultures and operating from different norms have different views on morality, right? We will discuss that issue some more later, but for next week, in fact, in module 4. But here we have a more significant counterexample to the idea that there can be no consensus on morality. And it's an even better example than the Galatians and Greek burial practices. Aquinas, one of the most important theologians and philosophers in the Christian tradition, if not the most important one, has this to say about charitable giving. Aquinas says, now, according to the natural order instituted by divine providence, material goods are provided for the satisfaction of human needs. Therefore, the division and appropriation of property must not hinder the satisfaction of man's necessity for such good. Equally, whatever a man has, whatever a person has in superabundance is owed of natural right to the poor for their sustenance. In other words, for Aquinas, charitable giving is also not optional if you have something in excess, something you don't technically need, something you can live without, right? And almost all people are in such a position. Okay, so we have this significant point of agreement between the utilitarian, in this case, a Christian thinker, but also we have a basis or a good example for how utilitarians target specific moral rules for modification so that we can make maybe an adjustment in the way that we think of charitable giving that will have a very, very big impact on the overall well-being of everyone. Okay, so that's it for this recording. We'll go back to this point, and if you have questions, of course, you can email me or write a post on one of our discussion boards.